Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Jim McKelvey to our screen. He's a serial entrepreneur, an inventor, a philanthropist, and an artist. He's the co-founder of Square with Jack Dorsey, was chairman of its board until 2010, and still serves on the board of directors. In 2011, his iconic card reader design was displayed at the Museum of Modern Art. In 2016, he founded Invisibly, an ambitious project to rewire the economics of online content. And in 2017, he was appointed as an independent director of the St. Louis Federal Reserve. His book is The Innovation Stack, Building an Unbeatable Business, One Crazy Idea at a Time. Welcome, Jim. We're glad to have you at Live Talks Los Angeles.
Thank you, Ted.
I guess first things first, you have crazy ideas in the title. So let's start off with why you went searching, why building Square was your crazy idea. What drove you to do that?
So I used the word crazy because I was trying to capture this idea of how much an outsider you feel if you're doing something that hasn't been done before. So one of the main themes of the book is there's this difference between business and entrepreneurship. And I use the classic definition of entrepreneur, which is a 100-year-old archaic definition, but it means somebody who is doing something that has not been done before. And these days, entrepreneur is sort of this word that basically means business person. So you can start a coffee shop and you're an entrepreneur. But 100 years ago, if you started a coffee shop, you were a business person who started a coffee shop. If you started an airplane company, you would be an entrepreneur because airplanes didn't exist. So if you were so the reason I put crazy in the title is because these days the word entrepreneur has become sort of denatured, but the word crazy has not. Crazy is not so much of a compliment, but it is the way you feel if you're doing something that nobody else has done.
So right off the bat, what I found interesting is, a lot of business executives write memoirs. Some write, I guess, what you might call a biography of a company, and your book is neither of those. It's like you picked at the elements of both of those and then wanted to build on it. So tell us about that.
Nobody wants to read another memoir, especially mine. So no, I mean, I used some firsthand examples because I thought they were good evidence, but how boring would that be? The original draft of my book was a graphic novel. So I basically wrote a cartoon of this phenomenon that I thought was super important to explain. And the reason I didn't want to write a book was because business books are typically very boring, dry, and I didn't want to take this super exciting thing, which was entrepreneurship, and sort of cram it down this really narrow, dry tube of the business book. And I maintained the graphic novel format through the first 5 drafts, and then finally it got killed in draft number 6 by the publisher. It got killed by the publisher and by Herb Kelleher. So Herb Kelleher, who was one of the guys who I studied in the book and who I brought my research to, was super important because I wasn't even planning to write a book. And I had all this research from history, and I thought, well, this might be valid, or I might have made the mistake that a lot of people make, which is they just cherry pick the examples from history that support their ideas and ignore everything else. And so I didn't want to be one of those people. So I took my research to Herb Kelleher, the founder of Southwest Airlines, and I said, Herb, I think Southwest lived through the same thing we lived through at Square, and here's my analysis. Is it right? And then I rated till the master told me, and he said, yes, Jim, you've got it. And he pointed out a few things that I missed, but Herb basically said, you need to go and write this. He's like, you need to tell the world about this. And I was so excited that I went home and started sketching cartoons because I thought this is a great story and it should be told as a graphic novel. And then I showed the graphic novel to Herb and he hated it because he didn't think it should be a cartoon. So Herb told me to write a book. Yeah. So that's how it became a real book.
Let's go back in time a little bit and tell us about for the first time you met Jack. He came and worked for you. Let's start there, and then we'll get a little bit into Square, and then more into entrepreneurs.
Sure. So I met Jack Dorsey when he was 15 years old. His mother, Marcia, sold us coffee beans, which we used to stay awake before the days when Ritalin was commonly available. And we ended up becoming work colleagues and eventually friends. But he started working for me when he was 15 years old, and pulled an all-nighter with us on his first day at the office, and he got in a lot of trouble with Marcia. So that's how I knew Jack, and I guess that was 25 years ago.
And at the time, I mentioned in your bio, you're a glass artist. You do blowing glass,
Yes,
right?
yes, I blow glass.
And you talk a lot about how a big idea evolves because it chases a big problem. And in your case, you had a big problem. You were about to sell a piece of art, and you could not take an American Express credit card.
Yes, yes. So the problem with being a glass blower, one of the problems is that you make something that nobody needs. So in my case, I was making this thing that was pretty useless, and I was very happy to get, it was about a $2,000 sale. And the lady presented an American Express card, and I couldn't take it because we don't take Amex at my studio. And so I said, well, do you have a Visa or MasterCard? And she didn't. She only had American Express. And I knew that her husband, who had the Visa card, would not approve of her purchase. She told me basically that, you know, if I couldn't take Amex, I'd lose the sale, and I lost the sale. And I lost the sale. This was a phone order. She wasn't actually in the studio. She was calling me from Panama. And I was talking to her on a cell phone that was called an iPhone. And I thought, why is this iPhone, which is basically a computer in my hand, unable to take a credit card payment? And so I called up Jack. We had already agreed to start a company together, but we had not picked an idea. And so I said, this is a problem I want to solve. And that's what became Square.
So let's go to the early days of, so you had the problem you needed to solve, and then there were problems with the whole notion of creating Square. Essentially, the business and industry you were getting to had roadblocks all over the place. Tell us about some of those.
So it turns out there were about a dozen reasons why small merchants like me couldn't take credit cards easily. And some of these were legal reasons. Some of these were just historical reasons. Some of these were, credit reasons. And if you piled all the reasons up, we eventually discovered that 17 rules, laws, and regulations were being broken by every Square transaction when we built the system. So we built a system that worked. And then once we realized what the banking system was doing and what MasterCard was doing and what Visa and all these other organizations were doing, there were a bunch of rules literally preventing what we were doing from being legally possible. Now, it was, of course, physically possible. So we then spent a year and a half trying to figure out how to either get the companies to change their rules or the governments to change their rules or becoming compliant with those rules. And I would say about 80% of the time, we were the ones that complied, and about 20% of the time, we had to get the rules changed.
And had you got venture funding at this point or not?
We had gotten some venture funding about halfway through that process, but we had not gotten the final rule change. The final rule was MasterCard and Visa had a rule on their books that specifically prohibited what Square was doing. And we'd taken about $11 million from Vinod Khosla's fund before we had even permission to do what we were ultimately going to do.
Walk us through some of your presentations that you did to venture capitalists. I was intrigued, and I found it amusing how you took their credit cards and ran small transactions to prove it, the model.
So there were two things that we did I think were very effective. The first thing we did was we started the demo by taking everybody's money, which gets their attention really well. So we would do this little intro, and then Jack or I would ask for a credit card. We'd take the credit card, and we would run it through this hacked device that was plugged into my cell phone, or it was my iPhone. And we would take their money, and they would say, "Oh, that's cool. Is that real?" And we'd say, "Yes, we just took $20 from you, and you will see a $20 charge on your credit card statement." And that got their attention because they'd never seen anything like that before. The second thing that we did was we honestly discussed everything that could kill Square. So we had a slide in our pitch deck that was 140 reasons Square will fail. And it had everything from a robot uprising to, an attack by Amazon or, PayPal undercuts us. We basically looked at everything that could kill Square. And these were honest reasons. A couple of them were crazy. But having that conversation about how a business could fail was just not something that businesses did. So especially if you've ever sat through a venture capital pitch, these tend to be very optimistic moments. And what happens is you get this sort of attack and defend mentality where the entrepreneurs are basically saying all the nice stuff and the VCs are trying to poke holes in it. And so we upended that entire dynamic by honestly discussing all the things we thought could go wrong.
And so of the credit card companies, the first two that you managed to convince was MasterCard.
No, they were the last.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, they were the penultimate. The first was American Express. We got Amex early. They just wanted money. So we agreed to pay their rates and they agreed to let us process.
And share with us in the big scheme of things, now sort of looking in hindsight, you look at every maker fair you go to, every farmer's market you go to. This was a market that a lot of the big players largely ignored or just didn't feel it was enough of a market to care about. Why did you see that this was, I mean, I understand in your case, you were trying to sell a piece of glass, but there's a whole industry out there that was completely not served by the existing credit card system.
Yes, well, it wasn't even an industry until we started it. And that's, by the way, the pattern that I noticed in the innovation stack, which is that all of these world-dominating companies began not by taking away part of an existing market, but by essentially creating a new market by serving a group that was previously underserved. So if you looked at the early Southwest Airlines passengers, they were riding Greyhound and Trailways bus lines. They were not flying in United and Braniff. You looked at the Square customer, they were just not doing credit cards. They were getting paid in cash or sometimes checks. And that pattern again and again repeated. A.P. Giannini, when he started the Bank of America, which became the world's biggest bank, started by serving farmers and immigrants and people that the other banks were ignoring. So this pattern again and again kept repeating. And we just sort of stumbled into it. I mean, it wasn't like Jack and I had this vision of every small merchant in the country using Square. We thought, well, that might happen, but it also might not because they've never had a chance to do credit card processing. So we don't know if this market exists or not. So we were really convinced that there was going to be one user of Square at the beginning, and that was me, because I wanted the product desperately, personally. And then it turns out that there were 2 million people like me.
So the notion of the innovation stack, are you processing this while all of this is going, or was this more of a reflective look?
No, no, I had no idea what was happening. The only reason I discovered the innovation stack was because about 4 years into Square's launch, Amazon copied our product, undercut our price, and was going to kill us. So when Amazon copies a startup's product and undercuts their price by 30%, that startup always dies. It's just 100% of the time has happened. So what we saw was that Amazon was basically coming for us and we had to react. Then we survived the Amazon assault, and I was happy we survived, but I was also mystified as to explaining why. And so, you know, it was one of these things, like it's like occasionally you will read a story about somebody who's like falls out of an airplane and the parachute doesn't, or jumps out of an airplane, the parachute doesn't open and they survive. Like they free fall to the ground and don't die. And that's what it felt like to survive Amazon as a startup. And then I had to ask a question, well, what happened? Like what explained Square's success? So I started looking for other companies that had survived Amazon. There were zero. But then I started looking back in history to find other companies that had been attacked and had had these terrible, terrible things happen to them. And I found a bunch of companies, and they all had this pattern of innovation stacks at their core, solving an unsolved problem and serving a market that previously didn't exist. And when you put those things together, I was like, holy shit, this is a pattern that is not an accident. I mean, it happened at Square and I lived through it, but I didn't recognize it until hindsight. So, I mean, and that's how I ended up at Herb Kelleher's office. I did all this research and I was like, okay, am I deluding myself? I need to talk to somebody. And the only person I could find who was still alive, who had actually done this and was willing to meet with me, was Herb Kelleher. And that's how the book came about.
Well, how do you explain Amazon sort of retreating in that space? I mean, they've got buckets of money. They could wore you out and stayed in there had they chose to. Did you ever get any insight as to why they backed out of it?
Yeah, so it turns out Square eventually hired somebody who actually worked on the Amazon team. So I got a little bit of insight, but this is actually after I wrote the book, so I didn't have it any of the time when I was writing it. But my basic thesis was that because we had an innovation stack of 14 different practices, so it wasn't just that we had this cool little hardware, or that we had cool software, or that our sign up was different. We had 14 different things that we were doing differently. And it is very difficult, even for a company as powerful and competent as Amazon, to do 14 things uniquely well. And that, added with Square's massive growth, which means we weren't leaving a lot of our customers unsatisfied, just left Amazon with a lousy product. I mean, they couldn't compete product to product, even though they were Amazon. Now, I'm not saying that Amazon, if it was their corporate mission to beat Square, would not be where we are today. Like if they trained all of their resources on us and had kept, spent $20 billion trying to rip us off and hire our best people and, undermine us, they probably could have won that. But the pattern that I saw throughout history was that these startups get attacked by very, very powerful competitors. And it wasn't just Square and Amazon. It was Southwest Airlines and United. It was Bank of America and 15 different banks in New York. It was IKEA, and Comprad basically got kicked out of Sweden when he started IKEA by all the other furniture companies. So these attacks are fairly common, and they fit into this pattern that we live through at Square. And the innovation stack protects you.
So let's get into the Square innovation stack. Tell us about some of these the items that make it up.
So the innovation stack is a really simple concept. It's just the things you need to do to solve a problem that has never been solved before. And if you're solving a problem that has never been solved before, you are going to be doing multiple things differently. You're not going to probably just come up with one thing that works. You're probably going to come up with one thing that works, and then it causes two other problems, and you have to solve those two other problems. And then in solving those two other problems, you'll find that it changes the first thing. And pretty soon you've got 10 or 14 or 20 things that are all different. And at Square, just to take you sort of a quick idea, we decided to make a system that had a known price. So prior to Square, your credit card cost as a merchant was unknown. It was this variable that not even Walmart knew on a day-to-day or transaction-to-transaction basis. It would change based on about 300 different rules. So we said, well, this is confusing and terrible. So we want to just give one price, 2.75%. And so, well, it turns out to do that, we had to do 15 different things differently. Like we had to have different software so you could sign up easily. We had to have different customer service. We had to have different hardware. The hardware had to function in a different way. The terms of service were different. The way we handled fraud and risk and refunds, all of these things were different, and they all affected each other in a way that when it was all said and done, we had this stack of, I think there were 14 in the book, totally different things that had never been done before. I'll give you an example. Square, because we charged 2.75%, would lose money on certain transactions because the credit card system operates on both a fixed and a variable cost per charge. So if you got a fixed cost, it doesn't matter, if you charge less than $5, you're always going to lose money on a credit card transaction. Well, we were losing money on all our transactions. So in order to combat that, in order to fix that problem, we had to have massive growth. So we decided to make sign up free. Well, if you make sign up free, then you get massive growth, but you also get all this sort of weird behavior because people start sign up and then they want to quit. And then, so we let them sign up and then we let them quit for free. So there was no contracts or anything like that. And all of these individual innovations added together was the power. And this is the thing about the innovation stack. It doesn't take there was no one single thing that made Square. There was no one single thing that made Southwest Airlines. And in talking to Herb Kelleher, he said, yeah, every time a company tries to copy Southwest Airlines, they copy 2, 3, or 4 of the things that we do, but they never copy the whole thing. And that's why they've failed.
Fair to say that your stack concept is somewhat like the Japanese Kaizen model, where it's sort of continuous improvement. You're always looking to build on something. You never arrive at at, it's not about finding the formula and then just scaling from there because things are constantly changing. Is it related to that?
Kaizen is more about humility. Don't think that your product is perfect, even if it is as good as you can make it today. And that applies to both existing companies and entrepreneurial companies. So if you have a company that is a traditional business, you can always make it better. You can always be better, as we can as individuals. So the concept of continuous improvement applies ubiquitously, I think, to all of us. Innovation stacks are a little bit different because you really see these only in the birth of new industries. At least that's the only place I've found them. Now, what happens, interestingly, is that once an industry becomes established, then over time, other companies can replicate innovation stacks. In the case of airlines, the Southwest model was basically copied by JetBlue. And JetBlue, over 20 years, was able to evolve a parallel innovation stack that's very similar to Southwest, but not identical. And JetBlue is actually doing very, very well. So over time, you see these innovation stacks essentially become the industry. So I'll give you the best example. What you now think of as banking was invented by a produce vendor in San Francisco, California in the early 1800s. So A.P. Giannini, who was a guy who sold lettuce, was so upset at how banking was done and how he saw immigrants and small business people being abused, that he decided that he would build a bank for them. Well, everything you think of as a bank right now, you think of a branch. You think of going in and getting a loan. You think of going in and talking to somebody. You think of being able to go in, even though you're maybe not a member of the aristocracy. Like you owe your current set of banking presumptions to this like produce vendor. The innovation stack that Bank of America or Bank of Italy built has now become banking. So continuous improvement is possible everywhere, but I really wanted to just focus down on what it takes to create something new. And then I wanted to sort of unveil this formula that really anybody could do, because if you look at the qualifications of these people, I'm a glass blower. I got an engineering degree, but I don't have a finance degree. Jack, his only professional qualification is he's a certified massage therapist. He didn't even finish college. So the two of us start a payment company, we're totally unqualified. A produce vendor starts the biggest bank in the world. He was totally unqualified. The kid dropped out of school when he was 15. A 17-year-old starts the world's largest furniture company. Again, 17-year-olds, totally unqualified. So it's very empowering to think that these world-changing businesses have traditionally been started with people who don't have the credentials that you would normally expect to be necessary.
It's interesting. I find that the people you're describing will have an idea. They'll go to the industry where they think it's applicable, and the leaders or people in that industry have what I call the certainty of no. They're dead sure why it's a bad idea and why it won't work.
Yep.
Somebody like you, as an outsider, isn't programmed to say no because they see a problem and they want to solve it.
Yeah, we're too ignorant to know why it's impossible.
So let me ask you this. Because I think this has been tried in larger companies where you want to create this little skunk works department and, remove the bureaucracy and allow a lot of smart, brilliant people.
Yeah.
Try to, I think GE has done this and a few others have done that. How well does that translate?
It depends on the company. So most companies have not been that successful reinventing themselves. I tend to not look at the companies so much as the individuals behind those efforts. If you have somebody who's really driven, they can get in and shake things up, but it almost takes a maverick effort. I consult with a very, very large quasi-governmental organization that basically runs every home mortgage for 80% of America. And when they try to create a new thing, there is this almost histamine reaction in the rest of the organization that tries to kill the new thing. Big companies get big by following process, and a very successful process can lead to a very successful large company. And those processes need to be respected. And so they have these systems in those companies to perpetuate those processes. Those processes, however, cannot handle new things. So if you're going to do something that's totally new, you're almost certainly going to run up against and violate those processes. So it helps in that case to be an outsider. The only other case I've seen work is when the company is facing some sort of existential threat and can get everybody into sort of entrepreneurial thinking, but even then they probably lose half the company. So right now is a phenomenal time to be an entrepreneur because like COVID-19 has essentially closed the world and everything is in chaos. So the big companies with these formulas that have worked for, in some cases, a century or more are being upended because, well, we've never had a world economic voluntary closure. Like we've had depressions and recessions, but we've never said, oh, hey, we're going to turn this machine off for a while and let everybody get healthy. Well, right now there's so much chaos out there that the big companies are disproportionately suffering because they're more used to order.
So, I mean, this square came about in the recession.
Yes.
Did that timing have anything to do with the success of your launch?
I think so. I mean, another pattern that I noticed, and I didn't highlight this very well in the book, I sort of apologize for that, but it's a true pattern, and I probably should write another chapter about this, is that disasters tend to create world-changing companies better than healthy times. So Bank of America, which was originally called Bank of Italy and became the biggest bank in the world, launched in San Francisco the year before the great San Francisco earthquake. And you think COVID-19 is bad, like a third of the population was displaced after that earthquake and fire. Southwest Airlines was viciously attacked for decades. They fought basically their entire existence. IKEA, which is study again, I mean, they had to deal with World War II. They had to deal with Reconstruction. They had to deal with, just devastated cities. And Square launched right in the depths of the recession. In those chaotic moments, the entrepreneur is disproportionately advantaged for two reasons. One is the entrepreneur's world is going to be chaos anyway. So it's good if your world's going to be chaos if everybody else is dealing with chaos as well. You don't want to be the only person, suffering from chaos and everyone else is working fine. Secondly, resources become available, which means you can hire great people. You can find great office space. You can find the things you need. And during moments of chaos, people become more open to new ideas. So like right now we're meeting over Zoom, okay? Well, how many of us were doing this 6 months ago? Yeah, like a couple of us, tech companies that had remote workforce. Like we've been using Zoom for a couple of years now, but you probably weren't, like most people I know don't know where the mute button is, right? But we are in a world of chaos, and therefore because of that, we're open to new ideas. So if you're in the new idea business, if you're an entrepreneur, having chaos around you is actually a good thing.
So in our business here, we produce live events. The lion's share of our revenue comes from packing theaters.
Yep.
In a theater, we would have probably had you in 2 or 3 locations, and one of our client locations at a business school, for example. And of course, all of that came to a screeching halt. So now,
and I so want to do that. Like if you get the live events, they go like, that's so much fun because you get to talk to people and I genuinely miss it.
I bring that up because early in the book, you talk about, you have this fascination with entrepreneurs and how you went to events and talks to meet people because you wanted questions. I want to hear more about that. I thought that because it made me think of myself sometimes.
Yeah, payback's a bitch. They're now stalking me. Yes, as a young entrepreneur, I used to offer rides to the airport to speakers at conferences. So I would go to something like LA Live, except it was in St. Louis, and I would find that. So first of all, the cabs in St. Louis, I mean, they were just like, it was like criminal business. Only it was like a badly run criminal business. It wasn't even like organized crime. It was like disorganized crime. And they would run you to the wrong places and the meters would be broken. It just all sorts of toxic mess in the cabs. If they even showed up, sometimes they just blow you off entirely. So getting to the airport was sort of a challenge. And so I had this deal where I would just show up at the conferences and I would tell people that I was going to give the speaker a ride to the airport. And I would always get to spend like half an hour in the car with some famous speaker. And that was how I first discovered that most of the questions that I had could not be answered by normal business people, because none of them could answer the question.
And why was that? Is that difference between an entrepreneur and a successful business person?
It was exactly that. I would basically ask a question that an entrepreneur was asked, which is like, how do I handle this insert situation that has never been done before? Okay. And the answer that I would get back is almost always of the form, find somebody who's had that situation and work for them, or copy what they're doing. Or, sometimes they'd be like, I don't know, but I never got the answer that I wanted to have, which is that you don't get to answer, you don't get an answer for an unsolved problem. You don't get to copy that. I can't hand you the formula for doing something that has been undone in human history. Now, I can hand you a lot of formulas that work great that have been done by other people, but I can't teach you the formula to something that has never worked before. But that doesn't mean it can't work. It just means that the first time somebody is going to have to go through this different process, which is invention, entrepreneurship, and it's a different type. So I was completely unsuccessful at my stalking of these entrepreneurs, or they weren't entrepreneurs, they were business people. But at the time, I didn't have the distinction clear in my head. I just thought these were successful people. But it turns out that what was successful for them was not something that would have been successful for me.
What is the role of luck as an entrepreneur?
It is huge and unknown. But I believe that entrepreneurs are very lucky and that luck doesn't get enough credit. Here's the problem. Let's say you're lucky and you're really working hard, but you become lucky for some reason. And there are 10 other people who are working just as hard as you and they don't become lucky. Well, you became lucky, you're the success. So everyone's going to want to interview you and they're going to say, Ted, tell us what made you so successful. And you're going to say, all this hard work I was doing, right? Because we feel that our work has output, and of course it does, and it has impact, and of course it does. But what if it was just luck? The answer is, as any individual, you can't tell, So I can go, gulp down, some crazy drug tonight and say, well, it's had this effect on me. I'm now, like I am. These are uncontrolled experiments. And the problem is that we tend to have, saying, look, I got incredibly lucky doesn't sell any books. Okay. You got to have some formula, some checklist, something that somebody can say, well, I can do that. Because if I wrote a book that says, hey, just get lucky, it's not going to sell. So the people who write and the people who speak honestly believe that luck is less important than it really is. But I know that I've been very, very lucky. And I try to remind myself to not get too headstrong. And that is why when I wrote this book, that I was scrupulously scientific. I mean, for a guy who basically was, writing a graphic novel, like I did, I did regressions. Like I ran the math to make sure that even if it was just correlation as opposed to causality, I didn't call it causality, because the other problem with luck is that it tends to separate us. In other words, give me somebody who's really lucky and they stand up on stage and tell you how they did it. They're also going to probably tell a hero story. They're going to say, the odds were against me, but I was bold or insightful, or I was a visionary, or I worked really. They're going to tell you some positive quality that explains their success. And the problem with that is, what if you don't possess that positive quality? Like, I'm not particularly disciplined. I'm just you can probably tell by the way I'm dressed, but like, I'm kind of a sloppy guy. Well, if you told me that the only people who could succeed are people who are terribly disciplined, I'd say, well, then I can't do that. I better go, have another profession. But if you told me, look, slobs like you, Jim, can be very successful because luck plays a part. And if you're just willing to get yourself in the game, then sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you'll succeed. Oh, well, okay, I'll sign up for that. So luck is really important, but it is immeasurable.
Do you think entrepreneurship can be taught?
It's funny. Look at this stupid thing that they just mailed me. Can you see? Somebody just from McGraw-Hill just mailed me a textbook on entrepreneurship. I came in my office this morning, and not for resale, but like, I want to burn this thing. If it wasn't so full of toxic ink, it would be set aflame, because like I checked out the authors, they've never done any entrepreneurship. They no. I don't think you can teach by my definition of entrepreneurship. Now, if you want to use entrepreneurship in its vernacular, the common definition, if you want to say entrepreneurship is just business, and if you're going to do business, we'll call you an entrepreneur. If you want to use that to definition, sure. The teaching is called business school, and go to business school. You can learn a bunch of stuff. And by the way, you can go out and find a business that's been done before and do the same thing, and you'll be successful, you'll make a bunch of money, and they'll call you an entrepreneur. That can be taught. If you're using the archaic definition that I use, where an entrepreneur is somebody who is solving a problem that has never been solved before, if that is your definition, then also by definition, we can't teach you how to solve it. We don't even know if the problem you're solving is solvable. So one of the things you have to do as an entrepreneur is wrap your head around the fact that you may fail, and you may fail not because you're not strong enough or smart enough or lucky enough, just because you've chosen a problem that current tools cannot fix. But you never know that until you try. But, and this is the frustrating thing about writing a book that's now been called a business book. Like, I submitted this to one publisher and they refused to read the book because it didn't have a checklist in there. Like, they didn't even read the stupid book. I handed them the manuscript and they sat down to talk to me about it. And I realized they didn't read the book. And I said, why didn't you read the book? And they said, well, your book doesn't have any checklist. And if it's a business book, it needs to have a checklist. And I said, look, my book discusses the process for solving unsolved problems. How many items do I need to put in that checklist? It depends on the problem. It depends on the circumstance. Like, you can't write a checklist for that. And they said 5 to 7. Like, you need 5 to 7 bullet points. Like, under 5, you seem lightweight. Over 7, you lose your audience. I mean, they had a formula for it. And look, they sell a lot of business books, but I don't publish with them because that's just silly.
Since you mentioned publishing here, among the various industries that have been impacted by the pandemic is publishing. Marketing of books are largely driven in some ways by putting authors on book tours and sending them across the country, and all of that has come to a screeching halt. So now that you've published a book, I think your book came out sort of before the pandemic.
It came out on the worst day possible. It came out on March 10th, which was the day the world shut down. So all of my news was white. I picked the literal worst day in a century to launch a book.
So share with us a little bit about your observations about dabbling in the publishing business and things you see, or maybe you were advising the head of a publishing house. What are the lessons learned here?
I wouldn't presume to advise a publishing house because I don't really know that business as a publisher. I did, however, run a printing operation that printed books for a bunch of self-published authors. And what I would say is that we desperately need to preserve the ecosystem that is publishing. And I want to do everything I can to make publishers money. So I'm perfectly capable of self-publishing a book. I wrote a textbook on glassblowing. I self-published it. It's the #1 textbook on glassblowing. If you want to learn how to blow glass, you're going to buy my textbook from me, from you know, like I got a stack in the back room. But I would never self-publish again in any sort of broad context, because to self-publish short circuits all of the critical things. So like an agent, you think, well, why do I need an agent? You need an agent because an agent is going to vet your book. Like I used Jim Levine, and Levine beat me up. All sorts of stuff that was in my book that I'm embarrassed about. He caught, got in my face, said, no, 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 no. Then the publisher. Like there's a process you need to go through. And I think as society, we absolutely need the publishing world to continue to be this vigorous, difficult thing. Because just because you put your name on the spine of a book doesn't mean it's any good. As a matter of fact, today, there's so much crap content that I desperately need publishers and editors and agents screening that stuff out. And so I would say, if you're one of these people who I used to talk to when I was, you know, printing books for self-published, they always have this thing of like, I know what I'm going to say, and I'm smarter, and I'm just going to write my book, and nobody's going to tell me what to do. And then and my response to that is, great, I'm not going to read it, okay? Because unless you've been vetted by an agent, unless you've been, you know, run around through a publisher, unless you've had, you know, 3 editors looking over your prose, I don't want to touch it because it's probably crap.
I want to go back to Square for a second. I have 2 little questions I wanted to talk to you about, and then we'll come back to a few other themes. First of all, the name Square, how did that come about?
So the original name for the company was Squirrel, and we had squirrel.com. And then Jack went to lunch at the Apple cafeteria and found out that their point of sale system was also called Squirrel. And though we didn't have a point of sale system at the time, we thought that was too close to us to be usable. So we had to scrap the name Squirrel. And the same thing happened at Twitter, which was originally called Twitch. They thought Twitch sounded a little bit, you know, unpleasant. So they started looking through the dictionary and went from, you know, the page with Twitch on it to the page with Twitter on it, which is the sound a bird makes. And they thought, oh, this is great. Jack did the exact same thing at Square. He started with Squirrel and looked around the SQs until he found Square. And we found squareup.com was a domain we could get. And so we were Square Up, which suited the company, I think, better than Squirrel.
Then the other question is, you as a glass blower and as an artist had a role in the design and what the little reader looked like. And I read in the book, you had a meeting scheduled to, like all people crazy about design, it's always nice to get a Steve Jobs endorsement. There was a meeting that was going to happen that didn't happen.
Yes.
And why did you want to meet with Steve Jobs?
We were hoping that Steve would save our butts. So we were violating one of Apple's rules, which was our reader had to plug into the iPhone, and the way to plug in was through the dock connector, which is that thing on the back with a bunch of different pins. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to do it with through the headphone jack, which was way better for a bunch of reasons. The bottom line was, by doing that, we were afraid that we were going to anger Apple. And so we thought that our solution would be to show Steve Jobs and have Steve get behind it and that he would save us. And so we had to do a really good demo. And I built a Square reader, specifically the very first Square reader that was small, I built for Steve Jobs. And because we had the meeting, and it was scheduled to meet with Steve, and I was terrified because Steve was one of these guys who, if he didn't like what you, so Steve was a design zealot. I mean, like, he didn't buy furniture for his house because there was nothing that was good enough. And like when Bill Gates showed him the Microsoft Zune, Steve refused to touch it. Like, he's like, if it's ugly, Steve doesn't let it in his world. And I had to build a piece of hardware and put it in front of Steve Jobs. And so I went to the Apple store and looked at all the stuff that I could copy from Steve, because I figured, well, he probably likes the stuff that Apple makes, so I'm just going to copy what Apple does. So all their computers were aluminum. So I bought a block of aluminum and I milled the first Square reader out of a block of solid aluminum. And I polished it up kind of like Apple does. And I shoved all the electronics in there and tested out. It worked, handed it to Jack. It didn't work. He hands it back to me. It works. I hand it to him. It doesn't work. We go back and forth like 10 times. And then I realized that Jack and I swipe differently. Like I don't touch the credit card reader when I swipe the card, and Jack would hold it in his hand. And when he touched it, because aluminum is electrical conductor, it was shorting out the circuitry and basically picking up Jack's heartbeat instead of the credit card signal. And so I made this giant mistake right before the demo that was supposed to be for Steve Jobs. Yeah, the first card reader was supposed to go for a live audience with Steve. Unfortunately, I should say this. Steve had to cancel the meeting. His health took a turn for the worse, and he was unable to meet with us. So we never actually met with Steve. But he was aware of what we were doing, and I think that may have helped us with Apple anyway.
So how involved are you in Square now? Other than
so I'm on the board. I am not a daily manager. I'm not a very good manager. So Jack's a good manager. He likes managing. I am not a good manager, so I stay away from that.
So one thing I just wanted to share with you. So we at Live Talks LA, we always get a bunch of extra books from every event we do. 3-4 times a year, we do a pop-up book sale. We have wine and cheese in here. You know, we stacks of books here and shelves around here. And, you know, people physically come here and they have a good time. It's a sense of community and buy stuff. And, you know, we time them to the holidays and so forth. And of course, the pandemic put a screeching halt to that. And with our revenue from live events also severely held back, you know, we started thinking, well, maybe we should build an online store. And completely out of the blue, I get an email from Square.
Yay!
Because, you know, we used Square whenever we had a store. We have the cash thing, and got this email saying, "You'll build a store." And I, you know, and I'd been working on a store. I probably spent a couple $1,000s of developers and programmers and all the complicated things you have to do to manage the inventory and shipping and, you know, tax and all these. And this email came like on a Thursday, and by the end of the weekend on Sunday, I had a store. You know?
Yes. Thank you.
You know,
my God.
And it was remarkable because in my heart, I knew this is one thing that's going to get us through this. But then I started realizing what it was going to take to do it. And I was like, I can't do this. And then this email comes, and I don't know if they must have had the foresight to think there's probably other people out there who have stores who maybe now can go online and you know, do delivery. And it was remarkable. It's really made a difference to us.
Thank you. That is so heartwarming because we have been building products like crazy for this pandemic. And we see merchants like you who need tools that they've never had before. So we've done things like this. And it's just so great when I hear a story like that, because that's what we hope to hear. You know, it's, you know, I get a bunch of those, and then occasionally I'll get somebody who's like, "Hey, you declined my credit card." I didn't decline your credit card, man.
Two other business things I want to talk about. One is motivation, and you talk about there being two kinds of motivation. One is perseverance, and the other is audacity. Can you address both of those?
So perseverance is the type we always talk about. It's the stick-to-itness. It's grit. It's the universally applauded thing. Audacity, I'll look back to the first question you asked me, which is why do you put the word crazy in the title of a book? And that is, to do something audacious, you will be called crazy. You will be shunned. Like if you're expecting to be an entrepreneur and accepted, that's not going to happen. It will happen in hindsight. When you've become successful, then they will give you the microphone and say, "Oh, tell us your story." But audacity is the precious commodity. It's the thing that allows you to look at a world and say, "Why doesn't this thing exist? I think I could build it." And then all your friends say, "Well, it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist and nobody's ever built that, so don't try." And you have to be audacious enough to say, "No, I think I can do it. And I'm going to bet, you know, my energy and maybe my savings and maybe my marriage to do this thing." And that's audacity. And it's this precious thing. So audacity is the thing that starts you going. Perseverance is the thing that keeps you going. And I'm actually terrible at perseverance. Like my Like I personally, I sort of over-index on audacity and I under-index on perseverance. And so I'm a lazy person. That's a 50-cent word for lazy. Okay. And so the way I personally handle my lack of perseverance is I work on problems that I care deeply about. And then because I care about them, I get a lot of energy to fix them. But perseverance, like if you could teach somebody how to be perseverant, that's great. But that's more of a common, it's commonly accepted that perseverance is a virtue. It is not commonly accepted that audacity is a virtue. And I want to make audacity more of a virtue.
The other theme I wanted to talk to you about is Clay Christensen introduced us to disruption. And everyone writes about it. Everyone is into it. And I feel it's sort of lost what it means and what it really is. What do you think?
I completely agree with you. So what is now called disruption, Clay Christensen originally called disruptive innovation. And it was this process that he described in The Innovator's Dilemma. And it was this formal thing that created new innovative disruption. Well, innovative disruption is a mouthful. So over time, that was shortened to disruption, since the word innovation is totally overused. So people would say disruption. And then over time, they stopped even learning what Christensen had talked about. They just started taking disruption in its classical context, which means destruction. So what was originally this sort of creative force became this force of destroying. And so if you destroy a market, you're sort of applauded for that in Silicon Valley, which I think is wrong, because at least in my research, all of the companies that I studied who had innovation stacks, there was almost no disruption at all in their markets. So Square is a good example, but I'll take Southwest Airlines because more people have flown on airplanes. Like Southwest Airlines didn't put any of the other airlines out of business. And more than that, when Southwest would open up a city, all of the other airlines who were serving that same city would see their traffic increase. So United would be serving San Antonio, Texas, and Southwest Airlines would open a new flight to San Antonio, and United's volume would go up. So again, we've sort of become lazy with our language, and we use the word disruption when we really should be talking about this very specific thing called disruptive innovation. And we shouldn't be looking for destruction as our goal. We should be looking for inclusion as our goal, like bring more opportunity to more people. And that is fundamentally not disruptive.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about the economy. So obviously, speaking of things disrupted, what industries, what sectors do you see coming out of this better than others? Any red flags you see out there for some that you think are going to take it a lot harder than we've already seen?
So disasters, and I'm on the Fed, so I get to see a lot of great economic data on a weekly basis. Disasters tend to favor innovators. And as we talked about before, there's chaos everywhere. So you're sort of relatively better off if you're going to face chaos if everybody else is in chaos. So this is a great time to start a business. But if you're talking about the businesses that are likely going to thrive, or more interestingly, what's going to change, then what I would say is we have broken the club a little bit. So it used to have to be in the club to get something done. It used to be, I'll give you an example, the geographic club. Like you live in a major city, I live in St. Louis, Missouri. Like you have more opportunities in LA than I have here in St. Louis. I can't afford to live in LA. LA is too expensive for me to live. So I have to live in St. Louis. I'm not in your club. Same thing applies with New York, San Francisco. You know, a bunch of the high cost cities are like these little clubs. And then there's the actual clubs, like the country clubs, the social clubs, the school clubs. What about schools themselves, like colleges, the elite universities? Any of these institutions where access is limited for some reason have been really hurt because they've been shut down. And what they're seeing instead is that people can work remotely from anywhere and people can participate from anywhere. And I'm talking to you from St. Louis, Missouri. And believe me, like I would love to be out in LA having this a face-to-face conversation because I think in a lot of ways they're better, but also like I'm not being excluded because I can't afford a ticket to LA. So what we're going to see, I think, is a diminishing importance of these clubs, be they, racial or geographic or monetary or just, who's your brother? It's a thing that I think holds us back. And I think they're going to be knocked out because, well, we've effectively shut them down for 3 months and probably a few more to come.
You were on the Fed in my last question, and then we'll let you go. Our president and lots of people like to point to the stock market as being this supreme measure of how well the economy is doing.
It is not.
And I agree with you, it is not. What numbers should we be looking at, sort of maybe in composite or together, to get a really better gauge of the state of the economy?
Well, the Fed does, track a lot of data, but I would tell you this, the real thing that we have discovered, and that we kind of knew going in, but we also have proven it, is that the people who are most hurt are not being measured. So when I look at something like the PPP program, which was supposed to get loans out to small businesses, it turns out the small businesses that had connections to banks got the money. The small businesses that had, maybe a checking account, but no real relationship with the banks, they didn't get the loans, and forget the companies that don't have banking relationships anyway, like the sole proprietors, the guys who's, mowing lawns and has 3 people working for him, but, has been, using, something like Cash App to run their business. Like those people were not connected at all. Now, fortunately, in Cash App's case, we were able to get connected and we were able to put PPP loans through, Square's rails. But it was really terrible to see how many people were not even being measured properly. And that was the great heartbreak. Now, look, I have to say, I think the Fed did a heroic job and a really good job of keeping markets functioning. And what people don't realize is that if the, credit default swaps market, which you don't understand and I don't understand either, fails, like it's bad for everybody. When markets break down, they tend to cause these domino effects. And, Jay Powell and the team did a phenomenal job of keeping those markets going. And then we've done a reasonably good job of, stimulating the economy using the tools that we have that are pretty limited. But overall, the great heartbreak is that the real damage is being done to a group of people that are still largely unrepresented in the measurements.
Thank you, Jim. Finally, if I can ask you one more question. If there's a company out there you'd like to go, and assuming they gave you all the access you needed so you can break down their innovation stack, who would you like to go and dive in and learn more and share with the world if you could?
Tesla. Because electric car is not just a battery on a chassis. It's microcapacitors. It's all these little tricks. And I look at the, sort of the future of automotive transportation is probably going to be electric. And I would love to see the innovation stack of how Tesla built their motors, how they're charging their capacitors, how they're handling their, cooling batteries is not a simple problem. Overcharging batteries is a problem. Like I would love to get into the tech of that, because I think they've probably got an innovation stack that's got 20 or 30 elements in it.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for joining us. Again, Jim's book is The Innovation Stack, Building an Unbeatable Business One Crazy Idea at a Time. It is available wherever books are sold, and you can also purchase a signed copy in the link below or in the comment section.